All right, so in the last video we finished talking about Schopenhauer's exploration of human beauty, and we talked a bit about his his epistemology, his theory of knowledge in regards to art and beauty and the will, and also what you might even call philosophy of mind. In this video, we're going to further elaborate on his notion of the idea in the Platonic sense, and the distinction between that and concepts. And drawing from this distinction, we're going to get at some of his criticisms of allegory. He doesn't like the use of allegory or symbolism in art. And so this video might be a little bit longer than some of the other ones, not much longer. And I think the next one might be the last video. The next video we're going to do focuses on his theory of the will in music. He kind of saves the best for last. He thinks that music is this particularly special art form. And so I think that'll be the next video. We might be able to do that and sort of the conclusion all in one video. It depends on how long it takes us to get through the stuff on music. But again, we've got a lot of stuff to cover in this video, so let's dive right in. This first quote, some of it should be familiar territory. It's maybe even repeating some of what we've already heard in previous lectures on Schopenhauer. But let's go ahead and start here. He says, "The truth which lies at the foundation of all that we've hitherto said about art is that the object of art, the representation of which is the aim of the artist, and the knowledge of which must therefore precede his work as its germ and source, is an idea in Plato's sense, and never anything else. Not the particular thing, the object of common apprehension, and not the concept, the object of rational thought and of science." So we've already seen how he said it's not the particular thing. When you look at the particular thing, the artist represents it in such a way that it brings out these ideal qualities in it and presents it as this sort of Platonic idea, right? But it's also not understood through the concept, the object of rational thought of science. He also mentioned that before as well. We're going to elaborate a little bit on that more here. Although the idea and the concept do have something in common, so there is, even though they're different, there's something. This is why maybe we get confused, Schopenhauer will claim, between the two, between the distinction between an idea and a concept. They both represent, as a unity, a multiplicity of real things. So a concept like the concept of dog, for instance, is representing a unity, as a unity, a multiplicity of real things. So there are a bunch of real dogs in phenomenal experience, in my actual experience of the world, a bunch of particular dogs, and I unify them as this one thing which I call dog, right? The concept of dog. That's the concept. But what's the difference between that and the idea, right? The concept, he says, is abstract, discursive, undetermined within its own sphere, only determined by its limits, attainable and comprehensible by him who has only reason, communicable by words without any other assistance, entirely exhausted by its definition. So it doesn't have any perceptual concept. It's just a linguistic form, you might say, right? It's a definitional form. The concept is just purely a form without content. The idea, on the contrary, although defined as the adequate representation of the concept, is always an object of perception. And although representing an infinite number of particular things, just like the concept does, is yet thoroughly determined, right? The concept is vague. It's just this sort of empty definition without any sort of qualitative content. But the idea is thoroughly determined. It is never known by the individual as such, but only by him who has raised himself above all willing and all individual to the pure subject of knowing. We've already talked about this in previous video. The will is subject, right? Detached from any of my concerns or cares or from my need to frame everything under the principle of sufficient reason. If that doesn't make any sense and that sounds like gibberish to you, you probably need to review some of the previous Schopenhauer videos. going on. It is therefore not absolutely, but only conditionally communicable. So the idea is not absolutely communicable the way a concept is, right? This is also maybe why it's partly a priori, as we talked about in the other video, the one right before this. It's partly a priori, this notion of the beautiful. It's not absolutely, but only conditionally communicable. It's on a certain condition, because the idea, you can only communicate the idea under certain conditions. It's only comprehended and repeated in a work of art, and appeals to everyone only according to the measure of his own intellectual worth. This is sort of Schopenhauer's intellectual snobbery or elitism, right? So just the most excellent works of every art, so that just the most excellent works of every art, the noblest productions of genius, must always remain sealed books to the dull majority of men, inaccessible to them, separated from them by a wide gulf, just as the society of princes is inaccessible to the common people. Right? Again, this is his intellectual aesthetic elitism here shining forth. And this actually, for those of my students who are actually taking this class at U of H this semester, if you were here if you were in class for my David Hume lecture, this completely flies in the face and completely contradicts what David Hume says about judgments about beauty and what is beautiful and good, and the greatest works of art are actually, maybe Hume doesn't quite say it this crudely. He doesn't say what's the most popular is the best. It takes time. Hume admits that there are temporary fads and that people get blinded by a charm that is sort of superficial. And so we might be tricked temporarily into enjoying a certain work of art, a song, a piece of music that really doesn't have much artistic merit. And the first time we hear it, it has a certain charm and has a hook. But the more and more we listen to it, the more we see that it's really deficient and lacking in spirit and charm. But ultimately, David Hume is going to argue against Schopenhauer. I mean, Hume was the century before, but he would push back if he were listening to this. He'd say, no, wait a minute, right? But Schopenhauer says, no. The finest, the greatest, the most brilliant, the most beautiful works of art, the ones that are able to represent the idea so perfectly and wonderfully in the most eloquent way, are going to be sealed off from the common folk. They're not as intelligent or sophisticated enough to fully appreciate it. We've already seen this side of Schopenhauer in previous videos, so I don't want to dwell on it too much here, but it rears its ugly head nevertheless. And there's something to it, take away the snobbery. I find that there are certain works of art that it does take time to develop an appreciation for. As a kid, I didn't really like most classical music. I thought it was boring. Some of it was fun if it was really catchy and had a really good melody or a hook, or especially if it was associated with like a Disney cartoon that I liked, or a movie that I liked. I might like the piece of music, the classical music. No, I love it. And I think maybe it takes time, maybe a certain level of maturity, and not just looking for constant flashes of entertainment. So there's some point to, I think, what he's saying here, but he is admittedly a bit of a snob in this regard. Okay, moving on. The idea, right now we're talking about not the concept, but the Platonic idea, is the unity that falls into multiplicity. This is kind of confusing, but let's read further and maybe it'll become clear. A unity that falls into multiplicity. This sounds like some, what the heck is he speaking of here, right? Let's keep going and see if this becomes a little bit more clear. The idea is the unity that falls into multiplicity on account of the temporal and spatial form of our intuitive apprehension, right? This is very Kantian, right? Everything that we see takes place under the conditions of space and time. The idea falls into multiplicity on account of that form of our experience, which can take multiple forms. Everything that we experience is in space and time. We can have multiple and infinite, pregnantly an infinite amount of experiences. The idea falls into that, right? The idea is something perceptible. This is very Neoplatonic. I think, Plato would not like to hear this, okay? But going forward, the concept, right, not the idea, the concept, on the contrary, is the unity reconstructed out of multiplicity by the abstraction of our reason, right? So the idea is this unity, right? We see in a work of art, let's say, we see, in a previous video, there was a painting of Delacroix, right, of the lion. And the lion painting, if it is a beautiful work of art, if Schopenhauer claims it's beautiful, he would say that it's a unity, right? So it represents the species of lions. It represents, all lions. But it falls into multiplicity on account of the spatial temporal form, intuitive apprehension. So we look at this picture of the lion, and it makes us think about the essence of lionhood, right? Why is this lion sort of the exemplar? Why is this the idea? Why is this the ideal? Why is this the perfect objectification of what the will of the lion is, this phenomenon in our experience, right? And it brings forth all of these different intuitions that are direct, right? That are sort of felt, not necessarily perceived. It's perception that it's drawn from, right? But it's our experience and our imagination. This is, I think, maybe I'm getting a little Kantian here and not quite as strict to what Schopenhauer is saying. But the concept doesn't do this, right? That's not what a concept does, right? The idea, the experience of the idea, again, it's something that we experience in the work of art. And it is almost I hate to use the term, a wellspring, from which all these sort of other understandings of the various lions, again, to keep with the same example, the painting of the lion. So I look at the painting of the lion, and it allows me to grasp in a unified and sort of robust and multifaceted way, all the ways of being a lion, right, can manifest themselves, right? And again, it opens up all these possibilities. Whereas the concept, he says, is the unity reconstructed out of the multiplicity by the abstraction of our reason. So we're not looking at a particular painting of the lion. We're looking at, I went to the zoo when I was a kid, and I remember seeing a lion. And then I remember I was watching The Jungle Book also as a child. I remember seeing lions, like cartoon character lions, right? I remember reading about them in school when I was growing up. And, there's all like these experiences that I've had of lions. And I kind of gather these up. And from that, I construct rationally my concept of lion. So that's different than the experience of the idea. We may express the distinction between the idea and the concept by a comparison thus. The concept is like a dead receptacle in which whatever has been put in actually lies side by side, but out of which no more can be taken, right? So when I classify something as a lion, all I'm doing is setting it side by side all these other entities, and I can't really add anything or say anything more about it than it's already in the concept itself. It's what Kant would call an analytic judgment, right? So I can't, unless nothing out of which can be taken that was put in. The Platonic idea, on the other hand, develops in him who has comprehended it ideas which are new as regards the concept of the same name. So when I see the painting of the lion, it gives me a new and fresh perspective on the ferocity, the intent, the dynamism, the force of nature that is the lion, right? Ideas which are new regards to the concept of the same name. It resembles a living organism, developing itself and possessed of the power of reproduction in a sort of intellectual sense, right? Not literally. It's not like a literal lion springs out of my head, but all these new intuitions and direct sort of felt understandings of the lion and of all lions and all their connections to all other things, right, is brought forth. and that brings forth what was not put into it. So that's what Kant would call a synthetic judgment, right? And I believe Schopenhauer uses similar terminology, right? The concept is analytic, it's definitional, and the notion of the idea, when we experience it, it's a synthetic judgment, it's a synthetic experience. It brings forth something that wasn't already there, right? It opens up new avenues of understanding and sort of completes the picture. That's not to say that concepts are not necessary or useful, but they're deficient in that regard, right? He says, the concept, useful as it is in life and serviceable, necessary and productive as it is in science, is yet always barren and unfruitful in art. And again, he's in line, I think, with Kant here, but maybe you might say for slightly different reasons. The comprehended idea, on the contrary, is the true and only source of every work of art. In its powerful originality, it is only derived from life itself, from nature, from the world. And that only by true genius, or by him whose momentary inspiration reaches the point of genius. Again, more on genius here. He sprinkles his comments on artistic genius throughout the world as will and representation. So we talked more about it directly in previous videos, but here it springs up again, right? The genius is the one who's able to recognize the idea in the particular thing and can kind of concentrate those qualities into some work of art, to some representational piece of art. Okay, so given what he said about the distinction between a concept and an idea, and that the work of art, the beautiful work of art, is a sort of representation or a presentation or a manifestation of the Platonic idea, he seems to think that what follows from that is that allegorical art that uses allegory or that is allegorical, metaphorical in other words, that symbolizes something else, is off the table. He does not like it. He thinks allegory actually gets in the way of art. And it seems like this is contradictory to Plato's theory of art. Plato didn't like art, he thought he distrusted it, but he seemed to think it was at least useful as a political expedient, that it was a good, remember the distinction my students should remember, a lot of them wrote their first paper on, their first essay on this, the distinction in Plato between the good lie, the noble lie, and the bad lie. So, for Plato, you can use art in an allegorical sense. Maybe the common people are not able to understand truth directly, rationally. Only the philosopher can do that. Plato was a bit of an elitist himself. So art can use allegory, this sort of symbolic meaning, to get the people emotionally charged towards truth, towards good behavior, right? But Schopenhauer thinks that allegory, he's going to argue, detracts from artistic beauty and is actually completely a separate thing, right? It actually is distracting, and it's not the essential task of the artist. Allegory should really be, in a sense, banished from art, he seems to suggest, okay? So where's he coming from here? Let's read what he says. If the aim of all art is the communication of the comprehended idea, which through the mind of the artist appears in such a form that it is purged and isolated from all that is foreign to it, and may now be grasped by the man of weaker comprehension and no productive faculty, right? Someone who is not an artist and might not even necessarily have much of an artistic perception. The artist is able to draw from his experience, present it to that person, and bring them into the fold. If further, right, if that's the task of the artist, and if further it's forbidden in art to start from the concept. Again, we talked about this just now, right? We just finished talking about the difference between a concept and an idea. If that's forbidden, then we shall not be able to consent to the intentional and avowed employment of a work of art for the expression of a concept. This is the case in the allegory. So when we're using an allegorical story like Plato's allegory of the cave, I'm using that as an example because we talked about it earlier in the semester. So my students will be familiar with the allegory of the cave. The point of the story is not to entertain you, although it might be a fascinating or interesting story. It's supposed to present you with this metaphysical picture of the universe and to get you to understand the nature of reality and the nature of knowledge and the nature of all these different levels of understanding or misunderstanding and truth and beauty. But for Schopenhauer, that could be accomplished just as easily with a philosophical essay, with a philosophical treatise. You don't need a work of art or a myth or an allegory of the cave for that. So for him, it's beside the point. An allegory is a work of art, which means something different from what it represents. Right? So it's a work of art that means something different from what it represents. The allegory of the cave, it's not supposed to be about a cave with prisoners. I mean, that's a superficial reading of it. But the object of perception, and consequently also the idea, expresses itself directly and completely and does not require the medium of something else, which implies or indicates it. Plato, I think, would partially agree with that. He would probably agree that the idea is directly and completely known. There's no medium, right? He seems to suggest this. There's different readings of Plato, but I'm kind of the opinion that this reading is the best one, is that the ideas, the Platonic forms, can't really be even put into words. Much of like what Kant and Schopenhauer say about the beautiful, that it can't be explained in terms of the concept. What they say about that, I think Plato might say of all the forms, that you can't explain them, but you can still understand them. There's this sort of direct intuitive perception. If you read back to the beginning of the semester, if you read that section from the symposium we covered, where Plato describes the form of beauty, it's very vague, right? The beautiful it's not beautiful because of this or that reason. It's not here or there, or beautiful because of proportion. It's just beautiful, period, right? Not on one day or this day or from this individual or that individual. So this part, maybe, again, Plato could be on board with, that the idea is directly and completely expressed through this media, without a medium, right? It's directly intuitive. But this idea that it's an object of perception, he would not be on board with that, I'm afraid, right? Plato would shun Schopenhauer's reading of him, despite all of Schopenhauer's praise of Plato. So for Schopenhauer, when you're looking at an allegory, there's a concept or a conception that always has to be signified somehow. And so for him, that means that the mind of the viewer is always going to be distracted by that concept. They're going to be drawn away from the perceptible idea, right? That Platonic idea that we have direct contact with through our perception. So it's drawn away from that towards the abstract, non-perceptible, that concept that is just an empty word or a definition. And it lies outside the work of art. So the work of art is intended to accomplish what is more fully accomplished by a book, he would say. So he'll give us a few examples of works of art that do use allegory, and he's going to point out how that part or that aspect of the painting, in this case their paintings, actually detracts from or distracts from what makes them truly beautiful objects of beauty. So he says, allegories in plastic and pictorial arts are therefore nothing but hieroglyphics. They're symbology, symbols that represent other things. The artistic value which they may have as perceptible representations belongs to them not as allegories, but otherwise. So a work of art that uses allegory might be beautiful, but it's beautiful not because it's an allegory. That the Night of Correggio, the genius fame of Hannibal Carracci, and the Hours of Poussin are very beautiful pictures is to be separated altogether from the fact that they are allegories, right? This is the Hours of Poussin that he's referring to. It's actually, the title of it it's more popularly known as A Dance to the Music of Time. But it's got these, these are all mythological Greek, demigods and gods and the Olympian gods, and they're all allegorical, in this case for time, the main is. So, as allegories, Schopenhauer claims, they do not accomplish more than a legend, indeed rather less. Maybe because of the distracting nature. It's like, am I looking at a painting, or am I trying to be reminded of the allegory? We are here again reminded of the distinction drawn between the real and the nominal significance of a painting, or a picture, right? The real significance, presenting the idea, the nominal, right? It might be some conceptual or practical purpose. So the nominal is here the allegorical. As such, for example, the genius of fame here pictured, right? The real is what is actually represented. In this case, a beautiful winged youth surrounded by beautiful boys. This expresses an idea, right? But if we look at it as a painting of Cupid or Eros, right? That represents love, the spirit of love, or the god of love. It's an allegorical. That for him is not, that's not what's going on. That's not the beautiful, that's not the idea. The real significance affects us only so long as we forget the nominal, allegorical significance. If we think of the latter, if we think of the allegorical significance, we forsake the perception, and the mind is occupied with the abstract conception. But the transition from the idea to the conception is always a fall. So for him, we lose out. We're losing out. We're losing out on a fuller, broader experience of the work of art when allegory forces us away from the object that we have directly before us, perceiving it, and to sort of putting it into some box category. Indeed, the nominal significance, that allegorical intention, often injures the real significance, the perceptible truth. For example, the unnatural light in the Night of Correggio, which though beautifully executed, has yet a merely allegorical motive, and is really impossible. So we see in this painting of Correggio the nativity scene with Christ and the angels, and there's a shepherd. I suppose this is supposed to be perhaps Paul in the background, and John the Baptist. And look at the Christ child. The lighting is unnatural, right? And in fact, he says impossible. There's no natural lighting, right? But it's allegorical. It's supposed to represent the fact that this is the Christ child, right? That this is the coming of the Lord, right? The coming of the Savior, or whatever, in Christian theology. So it serves as allegorical purpose within the Christian religion and the Christian faith. But in art, the allegorical part detracts from the beauty. It distracts us. If then an allegorical picture has artistic value, it's quite separate from and independent of what it accomplishes as allegory. Such a work of art serves two ends at once: the expression of a conception and the expression of an idea. Only the latter can be an end of art. The other is a foreign end. The trifling amusement of making a picture also does service as a legend, as a hieroglyph, invented for the pleasure of those to whom the true nature of art can never appeal. Right? So again, this is kind of snobbery, that last little quote there. Right? That if you're a common folk, you might be ensnared by this allegory even easier, right? But it's just a trifling amusement, right? It's not the true end of art, which again is an expression of this Platonic idea. It's true that an allegorical picture may, because of this quality, produce a vivid impression upon the feelings, but then when this is the case, a legend would under the same circumstances produce the same effect. But what really produces the effect here is the abstract thought, not the object of perception. This is interesting. I'm thinking of Aristotle here when I read this quote, because Aristotle seems to say something similar, but he draws a different conclusion from it. Well, maybe not completely different. It's in a different context. What am I talking about? Well, if you remember, my students might remember this. We went over Aristotle in our class before this whole COVID-19 breakout occurred. When we were in class, we went over the Poetics, and Aristotle was talking about the plot as an element of the play, of the tragedy. And so when you're constructing your play, when you're writing your tragedy, one of your compositional considerations will be the plot. And for him, you want to make sure that the plot is a very good plot, and that once you break it down to its most basic and essential forms, the simple telling of it, right, will produce the same effect in the listener as the play would, right? So, he gives the example of the story of Oedipus as a good example of this, that simply telling the facts of the story of Oedipus is enough to incite awe and horror and disgust in the listener. If you've never heard the story of Oedipus, just look it up. I'm not going to go over the whole thing in this video. You need to look it up because it's going to be important when we get to Nietzsche again. But anyway, the point is, the story itself is enough. Just tell the story and you're going to get the point across, right? But for Aristotle, he says that's a good starting point. If you got that, it doesn't matter even if you get bad actors or crappy production value, it's still going to kind of be effective, right? But for Schopenhauer, he's like, then why even do it, right? Why even produce it? Just tell the story, right? Great art has to do something more than to just relay a sort of certain response to the viewer, an emotional response that can be conceptualized, right? It has to be a presentation of the idea in his sense of the word. So if then allegory in plastic and pictorial art is a mistaken effort serving an end which is entirely foreign to art, it becomes quite unbearable when it leads so far astray that the representation of forced and violently introduced subtleties degenerates into absurdity. Such, for example, is a tortoise to represent feminine seclusion, the downward glance of Nemesis into the drapery of her bosom, signifying that she can see what is hidden. The explanation that Hannibal Carracci represents voluptuousness clothed in a yellow robe because he wishes to indicate that her lovers soon fade away and become yellow as straw, right? So he doesn't like allegory in art. He thinks it's distracting from the true purpose, which again is a presentation of the Platonic idea. And for him, the best and the most full, complete objectification of the will in art takes place in music. And he has a lot to say about music. He highly praises music as an art form, and there's so much for him to say. I feel like we've said way too much probably already in this video, so I better take a quick break, take a breather, and we're going to come back. And I think we might actually be able to wrap up Schopenhauer in one more video. It might take two more. We'll see how long this section on music takes, but we're almost to the end. And then we're going to move on to Nietzsche and look at the first half or so of his famous essay, The Birth of Tragedy, which is largely indebted to Schopenhauer. You'll definitely see that when we get there. So look forward to that. I will see you guys on the other side.